And you were telling me how you share these memories.
Yes. Firstly, this remembering the memory of the Prophet comes directly from the Quranic narrative, where God says that God and his angels invoke blessings on Muhammad. So those you who believe also join them in invoking blessings and asking grace. So this gave birth to a ritual performances doing that formulas, repeating that formula which occurred in the Quran when it ordained or asked the believers to invoke blessings on him and ask graces. So this became a ritual and very important one, which is repeated in our daily prayers 5 times a day that we do. And very interestingly, the formula which was recommended when the Prophet was asked that how should we do by the earliest community, when they asked him that how do we go about performing this which God has asked us in the scripture, how do we ask for blessings on you? The formula which he recommended was inclusive of the house of Abraham as well. And every Muslim who prays 5 times a day, at least about 25 cycles of prayers, at the end of every second cycle uses that formula twice, which says that, "Oh God, send your graces on Muhammad as you did on Abraham and the house of Abraham and the children of Israel." Sometimes some of our professors use it as a heuristic device by asking their students, who is this on which we are asking blessings? Allah Al Ibrahim. So Al Ibrahim includes the Jews, obviously, primarily. And the students who are unaware what they are walking into are sometimes receive a rude shock when they say that they invoke blessings on the house of Israel, Bani Israel, at least 25 times a day. So this was one of the primary ritual and the main activity through which we remember him. One. Then there are secondary forms of rituals, as well as other activities, peripheral activities like poetry, which is, I think, it's common to our all traditions, called qasida, or the praise poetry, eulogies. And obviously, the third element, which is a community activity of reciting or recounting the important events of his life in collective environments through readings or through sermons. So these are 3 levels of remembering his personality or his message.
Do any of the 5 fundamental pillars of Islam, you could review them, do any of them have a memorial component?
What component?
Do the 5 pillars of Islam have a memorial component?
Well, prayer, Muhammad Suheyl just talked about prayer.
No, okay, fine. I see what you're saying. But okay, in addition to there being this element of prayer that is entered into the Salat prayer, I was asking about the fundamental institution of the Salat, fundamental institution of the 5 pillars of Islam. Are any of those 5 pillars conceived as forms of memorializing?
Yes. The first pillar is the Shahada. That is, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. That is Shahada. I testify that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. Here, the first pillar includes it. Then the second pillar is the prayer, 5 times, the ritual prayer, canonical prayer of Islam. The second pillar, it also includes, as I just explained, in every second cycle, his memory. Then comes the fasting, annual fasting, the third pillar. And it also has a very strong component of how he did it and the special recommended forms which he used. For example, the fast that that the Jewish tradition observes on Yom Kippur, if I remember correctly. Do I pronounce it correctly? Yom Kippur?
Correct.
10th of that's.
Yes, correct.
And Muhammad, when he moved into Medina, he noticed that Jews of Medina were fasting on that day, the 10th day of Muharram, the first month of the Islamic calendar, that they were fasting. He asked, why do they fast? And when he was told that this is the day when the Jews came out of the slavery of the Egyptians. Is that true?
That's not the way we consider Yom Kippur. We celebrate coming out of Egypt in the festival of Pesach or Passover. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement.
I see, right. So when he was told that this is in memory of that event, he said, we should also fast on that day. So fasting, both in the ritual fasting, the 1 month of fasting has a very strong component, and also the non-obligatory voluntary fasting has a strong component which his memory invokes or was initiated by him. Then comes the fourth one, is the compulsory giving of alms giving, the fourth pillar. It again has a very strong component that his personal example of sacrificing every part of his wealth, whatever possessions, apart from which was obligatory. So here again comes that element which is personal to his example or his personality. And then the fifth, Hajj, is very much so because of the restoration of its Abrahamic form and cleansing it from whatever had crept in through the earlier practices of the pre-Islamic Arabs. So all 5 have, in one way or another, bring in a very strong component of Muhammad's personality or Muhammad's example.
Well, actually, can I go back to the first one, the Shahada? Yeah. You didn't tell us what the memory component in there, which opens up to a much larger question, which is memory and God. Because so far the conversation has been focused on memory and Muhammad. Why don't we talk about remembering God as an important dimension of Islam and how that relates to the Shahada and to other forms? I know you're a Sufi, so Sufis have special memorial.
Yes.
So tell us more about memory and God.
Oh yes, thank you for reminding me that's, I think I'd missed it, that's more important. That the first part of the Shahada, which is the cardinal thing, which is the basis of everything Islamic, is again related to memory. Because when the first part of a Shahada, La ilaha, there is no God but God, is pronounced, remembered, repeated, it takes back to that covenant of the origin, Alastu bi Rabbikum, which happened in the timeless time. And again, the Quranic, according to the Quranic narrative and lights, that no divine message was other than this. That is, there is no God but God. So remembering it, memory, both in the forms of ritual and as acts of worship and different forms of worship, the first part of the Shahada La ilaha illallah plays a very important part and works into the Muslim psyche throughout the life of a Muslim person. And as in the case of the formal ritual performances of blessings on Muhammad, this first part of Shahada, it has given rise to various forms of worship, litanies, and invocation, zikr, which is common between the Sufis and the non-Sufis, but more importantly in the Sufi circle, their main practice to remember, to revive, and remind, because zikr in itself, in its literal meaning, is reminder. What does it remind us of? It's again the same reality, that there is no real but the real. There is no truth but the truth. There is no, the same formula, when you put in every form of reality into it, it reminds you again and again and again of the same thing, that the absolute and the relative, the principle and the manifestation, the divine and the human, the vertical and the horizontal, how do they connect? So La ilaha illallah, the first part of the Shahada, is all the time related with memory and taking back the human to the origin.
So let me push the question a different way. Are there things we should forget? Is it sometimes good to forget? Or what is the flip side of remembering?
Mm-hmm. Good question. When we were discussing the question of truthful memory or misplaced memory, or memory that has gone astray or had been modified in an untruthful way, we mentioned a Quranic injunction that Muslims, beware, you should not be you should not become so possessed because a certain community has wronged you or has behaved or has been unjust towards you, that you in retaliation go away from justice. Right. So when this injection comes in, when you have to translate, you try to translate it into practical terms, you need to forget certain injustices. You need to forget certain wrongs that somebody had worked against you, just in order to be able to do justice and show compassion and forgive. So if you need to forgive, or if you try to be compassionate, you need to forget something or leave it away.
Do you need
did I make sense? Anything?
Well, do you need to forget, or do you need to rethink or rejig the memory? Sometimes the memory can be purified, is the term that...
Purified, indeed. That was the very point of it. If it has been modified in an untruthful way, you need to purify it. Or if it was a just cause even, and you forgive. Because we find in the lives of every saint and in all the prophets, both these sides. And the dominant side is of forgiveness. And when you forgive, it may be a case that you were right, you were wronged, and injustices were perpetrated against you, but still you forgive. And when you forgive, it's not just purifying, it's forgetting as well.
Maybe I can tie this. Maybe I can tie this into the next question, and then we can look how that would work together, which is conflicts of memory. It's certainly the case between Islam on the one hand and other religious communities, specifically Jewish, but also Christian, but also in India, there's conflicts of memory between Muslims and Hindus. So in the Islamic world, there are various conflicts of memories. How does this theory that you just shared with us of forgetting and forgiving, how does that translate, or how does it not translate into situations of memories of conflicts? And what would your wisdom, based on your Islamic knowledge, be for how to handle such situations?
Well, I think I have partly said something about that as well, that to handle such situations of conflict, first is the same injunction which Muslims need to keep in view, that for reasons that you have been wronged, or there has been something has been inflicted on you, you should not be unjust. One. Secondly, when the role model, the divine role model and the prophetic role model, in the case of divine, says that my mercy takes precedence over my wrath. That gives you a model that even to deal with such situations of conflict, compassion should have the better of it. Then the prophetic role model, that except for a few exceptional instances when he was ordained by the revelation to take certain stern measures against certain persons, his ordinary behavior or dealing would be of extreme compassion. So both these role models, the divine injunction and the prophetic role model, would call upon Muslims that dealing with conflict situations, they should also try, though it's an heroic thing to do, to suppress anger, upkeep justice, and try to do the most of compassionate, to use the most compassionate side of it.
Could you translate this into a specific instance, either conflict between Jews? After all, the whole Muslim claim of Jews falsifying scriptures, in some way a conflict of memory. We have nowadays conflicts of memories around Jerusalem, the Haram al-Sharif. Was it a Jewish site? Was it not a Jewish site? Conflicts as to the Babri Masjid. Could you talk about one or two of those cases specifically? How you think one should go about handling them in light of concerns of memory? You spoke about truthful memory. You spoke about compassionate memory. These are two categories you've shared with us. Could you implement them here in this conversation?
Yes. Let's take first the example of the conflict between the Jewish and the Muslim tradition on the case of the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, as they say. If you remember, in my article which I wrote for you, I had challenged the use of this very word itself, which was an example of an untruthful modification of memory, by calling it Haram al-Sharif, because Muslim scholarship throughout history until the time of this political conflicts had always reserved this word, this title, for two places, for Mecca and for Medina. Say Haramain, that is the two harams. And it was never allowed to use it for a third place. this was a modification. This was an untruthful falling away from the correct position or the truthful memory about Aqsa Mosque. So when we translate it into practical terms, Muslims should realize that they are not being truthful to their own memory of the same, even in terms of its nomenclature. Then second comes the example of the same place. The truthful memory or the Quranic position and the position of the Prophet and the early caliphs and much later into Islamic history was that Muslims became custodians or caretakers of the Holy Land because of force of history, not because a religious right or an injunction of the Sharia or the Quranic law. This was the position. When it was modified, a second thing dislodged this memory and turned it into a modified, untruthful memory, which took the position that it's a religious injunction and Jews have no right of affiliation, custodianship, or affinity to this place. Now, Muslims in this case had to modify their memory, which was in say late 19th century or 20th century, became untruthful, if I say plainly, with regard to this question. So this the second example. As for the Indian example, I'm not sure about that Babri Masjid. That my history of that part, I haven't done my homework well, and I answered this to one of our Hindu friends as well, that I don't know the details. But certainly there are situations where a conflict between Hindu and Muslim community takes place, and Muslims have to resolve or to exercise the same principles of compassion and truthfulness to that situation, have to change or to modify their position, their memory, which has gone wrong. Let me think of a situation in the Indian environment. Because I live in Pakistan, we don't have a Hindu community. So and Indian situation is quite different from Pakistan. Let me think.
We should move on.
Yeah,
Okay.
Suheyl,
Okay.
you'll allow me to move on. Please excuse my voice. I can hear it's very faint.
Yes, I do.
Sorry. I wanted to ask you about differences in Islamic memories, differences within Islam. You've just suggested that the quest for truth, for truthful memory, will help solve some of the conflicts between Islam and other communities. But what about intra-Muslim differences and differences in memories? Could you say something about them?
Yes, like all traditions, intra-tradition differences and memory also exist in Islam. And do you ask me to say something about the concrete examples of that differences?
Concrete examples would be wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let's take the second pillar of Islam, that is the ritual prayer. There are differences of how to perform it within the Islamic tradition, between the schools of law as well as the two main divides of the Shiite and the Sunni lines of the Islamic community. So there are differences on certain points of detail. A concrete example would be that where do you place your hands while you stand for prayer? Either in front of your breast here, or just above the navel, or you stand by hands on your side. There are three main positions to take, and different schools within the Sunni world and the Shiite world perform it differently. Now, this can give rise to a situation of conflict, a difference. And when you modify the memory or remind yourself of the right memory, that all these three positions were used by the Prophet at various times, and one of the schools thought for various through various religious arguments that this is the preferred one. The other said no, that this position, say your hands on your sides, is the preferred one. So if you allow your memory to be limited to one and don't remind yourself that, look, all these three were in fact used by the Prophet, and this is a question only of preferences, not of right and wrong and prohibited and allowed. So the internal intra-tradition difference, which, believe me, also led to situations of conflict sometimes within the Islamic tradition, could be solved easily. So that is one of the concrete examples.
That's a detail. What about, for instance, the divide between Sunni and Shia? Would you consider that an expression of differences in memory?
Yes, it is. It is, yes. And I cited that as my second case of intra-tradition conflicts, and where modification of memory helped to heal that difference or that rupture. And since it's a bit technical to explain to an uninitiated audience or students that the basic difference between the Shiite and the Sunnis on the question of whether prophethood is extended in the persons of the imams or not, which is the basic difference, is it's a rather delicate theological thing. But to simplify it, this can also, the modification of memory also, and there were initiatives to modify, to bring to close that divide or bring them near by modifying them. Both the positions, both the sides move themselves on the scale towards where they had modified that memory on the question of imamate or the extension of prophethood between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And when they modify it, as in the case of the Salat, this difference diminish.
So,
sorry,
I just wanted to ask, suheyl, is your response then that you should try to come to some reconciliation where you have the same memories, or are you suggesting that there's room to have different memories, multiple memories, and we can live with them both? Or do we need to agree on what the memory is?
Can you repeat that, please?
My question was, do you have to come to, you've used the word truth or realizing the truth in a memory. But my question is, do you have to all come to agree on the same memory, or can you agree to live with multiple memories or with different memories?
I see. Right. I think the situation is in between, that both sides have to forego something or modify something, but it's not the case of completely coming to a shared memory. You can live with different memories, but both sides modified different memories.
And that's the same intra-religious as well as inter-religious.
Exactly, exactly. I would apply to both the situations, yes.
By way of conclusion, could you recommend to us 3 primary readings, not bibliographical, but scriptural, that we could study to look and to illustrate some of these ideas on the significance of memory? We could share this with our students. What would you recommend reading?
Did you say extra scriptural?
No, scriptural.
Not scriptural.
Yes, scriptural.
Scriptural. I see. Scriptural that I would recommend would be the story of Mary, that part of the Quran which is named after Maryam. It's called the Surah Maryam, the chapter of Maryam. That could be a recommended reading because it includes all the traditions. And then the second part would be the story of Abraham. And the third would be how the most often mentioned prophet in the Quran is obviously Moses. And it's spread all over the Quran. One can make a selection of those parts of the Quranic narrative which give you the story of Moses alayhi salatu wasalam. This could be the 3 scriptures recommendations I can think of at the moment.
Suheyl, I want to thank you for your time and thank you for your inspiring and fascinating...
Peter, 1 second. Interesting, you didn't cite a reference to Muhammad himself in terms of memory.
I was going to ask about the hadith as well, whether that's where we need to go to hadith.
That would be, if I would like to add in response to your question, a significant hadith report which has throughout history always been used as a reading for explaining the self-statement of Islam. It's called the Hadith of Jibreel. That is the Hadith of Angel Gabriel. It's named by it. It's a short narrative, but it gives you in nutshell what Islam thinks of how Islam defines religion in the first place, and how it makes a self-statement of itself as a religion by relating it to the 3 dimensions of human existence with 3 dimensions of religion. So it's called Hadith Jibreel. That I would recommend, and we use it in fact for our teaching, for our courses on Islam as well as comparative religion.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and there'll be follow-up, no doubt.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Seeing you again. All the very best. Thank you. Alon?
Thank you very much.
I want to say, Alon, you want to say something?
Yeah, just turn off the recording.
Yes.